Hello, everyone. I love that animation. It's really cool. I'm Chris Brett from Eurogamer, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this talk for Battalion 1944, a game I think it's fair to say had an interesting launch, and it's, well, that's what we've got someone here to talk about. So we've got James Tatum, the lead programmer from Bulkhead Interactive, and he's going to tell you about the importance of QA testing, particularly around a game's launch, and yeah, sort of the way that Bulkhead approached that, what they learnt, and what they're doing going forwards. So, without further ado, could you please give a very warm welcome to James Tatum?
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I do have a slightly more in-depth introduction of myself on the first slide of the talk, because that's the way that I like to roll. So, my name, as I have been warmly introduced, is James Tatum. I studied computer games programming at the University of Derby, during which time, in my final year, I worked on a vertical slice with 11 people of a game called Courage. I also, during that time and following years, worked on a game called Sure Footing, which is out in the indie zone right now, which released recently. A number of the dev team are actually in the audience, so there they go. Following that, I actually went and did some academic research work, which was really boring, so we're not going to talk about that. But I did it for 6 months with Plymouth University. And then I moved to Bulkhead Interactive, where I've been at 2 years now. I, during that time, worked on the Turing test, and now Battalion 1944, which released on February 1st this year. Kind of helps to know what Battalion is before we talk about how we tested it and how we failed to test it adequately. So, it's a multiplayer arena first-person shooter. If you don't know what that means, it basically means it's Call of Duty. It's very similar style. It was inspired by Call of Duty 2 and Call of Duty 4 with some Counter-Strike elements because it's a competitive game. We had 3 different types of game mode. So we had the competitive Wartide, the unranked Wartide, and arcade game modes, which encompass Team Deathmatch, Domination, and Capture the Flag. Wartide being our competitive mode, but the unranked actually allowed for greater selection of weapons and no ELO ranking, so people were just matched against each other so they could just play and learn the game mode. Wartide is entirely 5v5, but we recently upped our arcade game modes, Team Deathmatch, Domination, and Capture the Flag, up to 8v8. We have matchmaking and community servers. People can host their own servers, and it was made in UE4. Now, the servers is possibly the most important point because we needed to test it all. As a company, we only have 20 people. Doesn't really help when you're trying to test an 8v8 game, because that is most of the company. So we have actually never successfully tested an 8v8 game because we don't have the computers. We have a build system consisting of Jenkins, which just does all of our builds for us. We have only 4 build machines, one of which is constantly building our DLL, and what that means is that anytime a programmer does any code, that is built and distributed to the whole studio so that everyone has the latest, which means we actually only have 3. And when you consider that we need to build a client, a Windows server, and a Linux server, that is all 3 gone immediately. So you can only ever do 1 suite of builds at a time. We also have a bunch of Steam branches, dev, release, our publisher branch, and third party for all sorts of testing and stuff that happens in the background. And we have back-end services, which are GAE and PlayFab. GAE stands for Google App Engine. That is the brain of our game. You can't do anything without communicating with it, including clicking the play button. Say you're doing a build. This is actually the whole process from beginning to end. So you click the build button, and then you wait for the build to finish. Now, that takes 1 hour and 20 minutes for a client. It's a very long time. During that time, you wait. I mean, you don't wait. You actually do some work, because we're not paying people to sit around, and nobody wants to just sit around for 1 hour and 20 minutes and do nothing, because that's boring. But then you forget the build was happening, so add another 10 minutes on, because now it's 1 hour and a half, because you were too busy engrossed in whatever you were doing. So then you go to the deployment machine, because we don't have any automatic deployment, which is kind of part of what I'm going to get at in a bit. So you go over there and you run the deployment script, and it gets automatically deployed to our 10 testing machines, except you forget that that happens too. So you're waiting 20 minutes for the deployment, and then you add another 10 minutes on because you forgot that you were doing it, because, again, you got engrossed in responding to emails, or you got engrossed in fixing a bug or whatever. And then you test. But that means that the whole process from clicking the build button to actually testing the game is 2 hours. Now, that is a fair chunk of the day, right? So here's the issues with our infrastructure as it stands right now and has up until the release. We have long build to test times. 2 hours a pop. You're waiting 2 hours before you test anything, and then you need to fix all the issues that are with that. You can do maybe 2 tests in a day, if you're lucky. We could only do 1 set of build configurations because of the client, Windows Server, Linux Server whole issue, only having 3 build machines. And testing costs half of our studio. Now, that is with a 5v5 game, because we're 20 people, 10 people testing it. As I said, we have never tested an 8v8 game, because we just don't have the personnel to sacrifice at any given time. Rather than a test manager, a programmer dictates the test. Now, that is literally a case of programmer does a bunch of work, and then they submit the work, and then they turn around and say, I need to test that. So at some point, we say, OK, cool, we'll test it. Now, it would be kind of stupid if everyone did that, jumped and did it straight away, because then you're distracting people. But we try and schedule it to say, OK, tomorrow afternoon or something like that, we'll get everyone together and we'll test. So you can actually be testing multiple of a programmer's work together. But that means that those programmers are usually dictating the test because they're the ones that have done the work that needs to be tested. Now, during the lead up to our release, we were developing rapidly. Now, when I say rapidly, I mean I've never seen anything like it, ever. Within days, it actually says on here within days, but it could be within hours, work that we'd done would be out of date. So you would kick off a build, and then you'd carry on working because we just didn't have the ability to not, because we were pushing for a release. Our publisher in particular was very annoyed at this because we would hand over a build, and then they'd go to test it, and it wouldn't work anymore because we changed something with GAE, and suddenly the endpoints didn't exist or something like that. Now, the way around that is actually sandboxes to environments. You turn around and say, this build is now in this environment, and then you create a new instance and say, now we're going to work on this instance. We didn't do that. We didn't have the functionality. We didn't have the ability to do it at the time. So, yeah, there was no real way to test previous builds, much to their frustration. We couldn't test 8v8, and our teams have different levels of ability. When you're testing a competitive first-person shooter, and you have someone who is essentially a god compared to everyone else, it unbalances the test and makes it really difficult when you're trying to test gameplay in particular. Try balancing a game when the people that are playing are already imbalanced. It is nigh impossible. A note on early access, before we get on to the fixes, is that Battalion 1944 released into early access on February 1st. Early access can be defined under many different scopes. And if you talk to each person, they will define it in their own way. Now, for us, early access was always about testing. We didn't have the resources or the personnel to test our game ourselves. That is essentially the bottom line. So we had to do things and rely on the community to test it for us. Now, this is brilliant in some ways and really painful in others, because when you've broken something and you need to push it out to the thousands of people who are playing your game, they get pretty frustrated, understandably. So didn't really go well. And one particular example of that is something called an outgoing reliable buffer overflow. This is a bug that we experienced twice. The second time, I did a lot more in-depth write-up, which the link at the bottom actually goes to on Reddit. But the crux of the issue is that UE4 uses 2 different systems to do networking, called replication and remote procedure calls, which are RPCs. Networking traffic is broken down into bunches or packets and sent over the network to people, but these are actually collated together before they're sent. Now, there is a hard-coded limit inside the engine to say we will not send too much traffic to any given client. If you go over that limit, UE4 will actually cut the connection and then say, I reached an outgoing reliable buffer overflow. A lot of people experienced this issue after we accidentally put a line of code in that on tick was updating a timer on every single client. Now, 10 clients connected to a server, that's 10 connections per tick that are being updated. That is a lot of network traffic, and it halted the game for most people. I would highly recommend going and reading the write-up, because that is a very brief overview where there is a lot more information, hopefully explained in a way that everyone can understand. I mean, Reddit seemed to react nicely, so that's the best you can ask for. So there is a better way. There is always a better way. But in particular with what we did, our way was kind of rubbish. A basic but full testing flow from day one is recommended. Now, by that I mean, if day one you're building a first-person shooter or any game, and you can click and shoot, well, that's a test. Now, at that point, you want to build a testing framework so that from day one, as you grow your game, you can test everything as you go. It makes it a lot easier and something that I wish we'd done, but we didn't. Test what you got when you got it is basically the motto of this. Automated deployment and testing within limits. You know, every company, particularly indie companies, don't have money or time to throw at developing tools or lots of crazy expensive deployment software. So try and build your own deployment quickly, doing some kind of rapid development. I mean, ours took a day. It is a bunch of batch scripts. It is a horrible mess, but it works. Doing that, it's going to make everything so much better. Because rather than having to put the build on each VC, you can click a button and it does it automatically. Now, that cuts your time a lot. Also, get some reporting going on. So we are facing an issue right now in that our performance has gone down in an update. We released one update. Every single person lost about 30 frames per second. To a competitive gamer, that is a lot. They can feel it, and they care. If you are every build benchmarking and creating a report, which sounds like a lot of work, and it is, but doing that allows you to easily identify when you are losing frames as you go. Now, with a game like a first-person shooter, that needs to be optimized a lot. So having the reporting and seeing when things changed is invaluable, and we have only recently started doing this as a result of losing so much performance. I'm going to say build a build system, as if that's not a weird thing to say, but build a build system for faster, more reliable, and more concurrent builds. We can only do one suite of builds. We are currently investing in more build machines and a better build system so that we can do more. Because we kick off one build, all the build machines are consumed for 2 hours. You can't do anything else. Whereas if you could at least have 6 machines, now you can do 2 builds within 2 hours instead. Makes it a lot nicer, particularly when you're doing a lot of quick development on some features and you need some testing. If it involves networking, sandbox your environments. Now, as I spoke about, we didn't. Sandboxing allows you to throw a bunch of code in, push it out, lock it off. So now that build is always going to work regardless of what you do. Now, at some point, you're going to say, right, that sandbox is useless anymore. Let's get rid of that. But it might take 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month before that happens, as opposed to an hour. Now, that particular point is kind of built on top of our rapid development, but I think it's a valuable piece of information to take to any networking game, particularly when you are messing with any kind of backend. If you are doing even single-player games, if you are firing stats to some kind of backend and you change it, the stats suddenly don't work, then you've broken it. So having a sandbox to fall back on is great. And empower your individual developer. Now, we are sort of taking a stance of a programmer is in charge of their test. Before, it was always, you do a bunch of work, and then we'd sit down and test. Now it's, you define when you need to test and what you need to test. It takes a bit of getting used to, and this is actually a model that Valve employ, and that's where we stole it from, but don't tell them. It's a bit weird. You don't want to turn around and say, you do a bit of code, you commit it, OK, let's do a build and test that immediately, because you're going to spend more time testing than you do actually developing. Nobody wants that. But if you can say that once a week on a Friday afternoon, you are going to test everything that has happened this week, and then every developer is going to say, OK, we're going to put them in an order and say, right, Joe, you did some development on this, let's test this. Jack, you did some development on this, let's test this. You go through a process, especially as you get the ball rolling and get into the flow of it, it's going to make everything so much swifter. And guess what? A QA team is costly. So if you're an indie developer and you cannot afford it, which we're at Rezzed, so I assume everyone's an indie developer, to be honest, you can't afford a QA team, so you're going to have to do it yourself, and you need to figure out how. The takeaway. This is the bottom line. This is what I want you to take from this. Testing is important regardless of what stage you are in development. I don't care if it's day 1. I don't care if it's 672. You are going to need to test every single day. Because the reality is, you make a mistake and it will haunt you. And it did us. So a good infrastructure makes testing more efficient and beneficial, but the testing is the call. Do the testing. Don't make the same mistake we did. And implement both of these things regardless of how basic. If your deployment system is exactly as ours is, and it's just a bunch of bash scripts that just send a bunch of the executable to every single machine, that's fine. I mean, yeah, we're going to improve ours, but it's served us well for the last 2 years of development of Battalion 1944, so it must be okay. It's just not perfect, you know? Any questions?
Thank you so much, James. Yeah, so there's a microphone here if anyone wants to stand up and ask some questions. I think I'll kick off. So obviously we've talked about the launch of Battalion 1944 and what you've learned from the testing itself. Could you tell us a little bit about what's in the works now, what's coming in the future for this game? What are the team working on right now?
I can say that we're pushing towards a major update, probably in June, but I don't want to commit to a date when I don't have that information. It's going to include a revamp of our wartide game mode, so that the current iteration doesn't support a competitive mode very well. It was very quickly developed. We're now working on a more in-depth game mode. There's also going to be some performance and stability improvements, because as I said, the game wasn't very performant, wasn't very stable until recently, and that's what we're working on right now. And some other secret surprises that I don't think are announced, so I can't talk about them.
I thought I'd try, at least.
Yeah, it was worth a try.
And how confident are you that your remodeled approach to QA testing is going to hold up with those updates?
Well, I'm pretty confident that when we get it all up and running in the way that we have designed it, then it will be fit for purpose. Mm-hmm. Our current testing isn't, and that's kind of what the whole talk is about, right? The problem is that getting the whole suite up and running takes time and money. So it'll be a little while before it's ready, but I'm fairly confident in it, yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll hold you to that.
Yeah,
Okay. I think James is going to be sticking around after the talk for a little bit. If anyone wants to have a chat with him, ask him some questions more privately. But yeah, thank you so much. If we give him a big round of applause, James Tatum.
Dum 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 dum.